what has teleology, deontology, etc. got to do with bioethics? Bioethics is just one domain of ethical behavior. You have media ethics. I mean, can a journalist set up cameras right outside a person's house and prey on that person all the time? That's an ethical issue in media. Yet there is a certain amount of privacy, issues of privacy involved. That would be in media ethics. So when you're talking about ethical issues that emanate, that come up from medicine, especially as it pertains to life forms, that is bioethics, correct? These issues, look, there are classic examples. Issues of abortion, of euthanasia. Now, how do these principles have a bearing on this? Supposing you have a doctor is confronted with a case of abortion. Somebody, a young woman, approaches him to get her child aborted. Now, the doctor can approach a decision with respect to whether he or she should perform the abortion, either by thinking ethically, egoistically, saying, look, in our country, abortion is not, or maybe at the time when it was not legalized, I think now it is under certain circumstances and frameworks. But at the time before that, you say, I would attract a lot of unwelcome attention if I went into this abortion, etc. He would be approaching it from an ethical, egoistic point of view, because his concern would be to increase his own satisfaction. And then, I mean, he wouldn't be a good doctor. He wouldn't be perceived as a good doctor. Nobody will come to him, and so on. Okay, that would be it. Or he might approach it deontologically, saying it's my duty not to kill. I will not kill. That would be a deontological perspective by which he would arrive at a decision. Or he could approach it teleologically and say, now, look, is it to the benefit of everybody? It might be to the benefit of this particular girl, okay, because it might be an unwanted pregnancy and she doesn't want repercussions at home or in her workplace, etc., people to know that she is carrying a child. So it would definitely be to her benefit. But the doctor might still continue to say, okay, I perform this abortion. What happens to, to the practice? More and more people would come to just get aborted for these trivial reasons, maybe, instead of life-threatening reasons. So he can take a utilitarian framework and keep thinking about the consequences. So if your concern is with how these perspectives impact on bioethics, oh, it's there all around you. So these are perspectives, these are theories, which are attempts to offer you a criterion, a justification for what you decide you should be doing if you want to be moral with respect to a particular act. That is what this is. What we saw yesterday, very briefly, are some outlines of some ethical theories, okay? Two of them, basically, ethical egoism and utilitarianism. But we also had to address a psychological theory, which has nothing to do with ethics. It is just describing the way human beings are. But if we accepted that theory, or if we find reason to accept that theory, then there is no point embarking upon any of this that I'm doing, or that even Professor Pravesh would be doing, okay? Because what it says is that the only motivation for human action is satisfaction. If that is the case, what is the point of my telling you even to seek satisfaction? There's no point in my telling you to seek satisfaction for yourself, because that is the way you're going to be, and you can't be any other way, okay? And still less is there a point in my telling you not to seek satisfaction. So the point is that we had to confront that theory, and there are quite a bit of problems with it, but the major problem is that it is an assumption with no evidence. Do you know, there is a very famous fallacy which maybe Professor Jung chose not to include. It's called begging the question. It's, or arguing in a circle. What it is using your conclusion, that which you have to establish, as evidence for itself. Now that is what is begging the question. That is precisely what you have to prove. that somebody is doing X out of or in order to get satisfaction. And all their responses, look, but he's doing it, no? How do you know he's doing it because of satisfaction? We want to know that. And your evidence is that he is doing it. It's like saying, you know, I mean, this is a caricature of an example, but God exists. How do you know? The Bible says so. And then you ask, but how do you know that what the Bible says is true? Because the Bible is the Word of God. Now, if you argue in this fashion, you have already presupposed God's existence in order to establish His existence, isn't it? You are presupposing God's existence. How? By saying that the Bible is the Word of God. And you're using that to establish that God exists. So this is logically wrong, logically fallacious. Okay, put paid to that. Ethical egoism, basically the mainstay of ethical egoism is increase to the maximum your interest. Not advocating selfishness necessarily. It is saying you can spend your whole life in altruistic service. If you believe that that is to your interest, go ahead, do it. So they are not telling you to be selfish. They are telling you to look after your own interests. And not just you, everyone should. The problem immediately that should come from you is, look, if everyone tries to maximize their own interest, nobody is going to be able to maximize any interest, right? We'll all be stepping on each other's toes. My interest will conflict with your interests, and your interest will conflict with somebody else's interest, so how can all of us maximize our interest? They come back to us saying, look, that is a factual issue. That is a matter of the way the world is done. That is the way we are. But in theory, it is entirely possible. So it's not logically contradictory to suggest that everybody should try and maximize their own interest. By maximize, I mean increase, yes? Because we'll come up with another word, another use of the word maxim very shortly, which has nothing to do with increasing your own interest, etc., when we come to Kant. But more than that, what ethical egoism is advocating is prudence as the supreme virtue. Now, whether prudence is a virtue or not is itself an issue. You know what prudence is? Prudence is looking out for yourself at all times. For instance, it would be imprudent on any of our part, anybody's part, to just rush across from the gate to the other side, to BDA complex, especially at 6 o'clock in the evening, okay? Maybe at 12 midnight it might be less imprudent, but at 6 in the evening it's terribly imprudent. Why? Because of the traffic. You don't know when you're going to be hit, so you'll need to be a little bit prudent. So what ethical egoism is recommending is that prudence should be the only virtue. Now, how does that vibe with our common moral consciousness? No. Even if we want to grant that prudence is a virtue, a moral virtue, I mean, do we build statues, you tell me, to people who are prudent? Supposing you are confronted, okay, with rainy season. There's a nalla that is flooded. And you see a child being washed away by the current, a very strong current. You are not a swimmer at all. And it would be very imprudent on your part to jump into the nalla, right? To try and save the child. But you would applaud such an action. Would you or would you not? If somebody did it. And suppose somebody decided on the basis of prudence, say, no, you know, if I have to maximize my own interest, I could possibly drown over there. And so better to not do anything, quietly turn away, or maybe not so quietly turn away, shout for help, etc., etc. But you know that there are some people who, without a thought, would just jump in. And maybe they will die. But then people will honor them. We honor imprudence in that respect. And that is a common shared. It's not an anomaly by which we applaud such people. We would say those people are morally very courageous to have done that kind of thing. So prudence really is not a virtue. And ethical egoism puts it on a pedestal and says that is the only virtue you should aim at. And you say, wait a minute, that we don't know. But more than that, ethical egoism is suggesting that anybody and everybody should, in all their actions, look after their own interest. Now you have two people, or you have another person coming to you for advice, counseling, something that some of you all are into, Yes, maybe as doctors, you would have to counsel your patients. No, not only prescribe drugs, at times you would have to counsel them. Now, if you are an ethically, egoistically oriented doctor, what would you have to look after? The patient's interest or your own interest? You would have to see whether counseling the patient is in your own interest or not. And you say, wait a minute, that takes away a lot of the meat, the substance of counseling, isn't it? Counseling is when I come to you for my problems, I need you to advise me on what is the best mode of action to undertake, and you are looking after your own interests and advising me accordingly. That somehow does not fit. Okay, so these are all some of the problems with ethical egoism. Let's move on. Utilitarianism says you maximize satisfaction again, but for the general good, and not excluding yourself, but not also making yourself to be more than just one among the others. You do count, but you don't count in any special way. You count as any other person would count. So everybody's interest should be maximized. You should try and maximize everybody's interest. And we saw that, in order to do that, you would have to come up with some mode of calculation. We saw elements of the calculus in terms of Bentham's calculus, okay? We saw some problems with that, apart from the practical problem of how do we sit down and calculate when we don't even know all the consequences of our actions, etc. There is one problem that Pravesh reminded me of with respect to utilitarianism, which I had forgotten to mention. Very important issue. See, there is, at least in the Benthamite calculus, the way Bentham formulated it, in terms of those intensity and nearness, propinquity, and certainty, and all those issues. How do you distinguish qualitatively between satisfactions? Pardon? How do you distinguish? You can distinguish in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality, how do you distinguish a satisfaction? And there Bentham's calculus doesn't seem to aid us. I'll just give you a statement by Mill, where he sought to take that under advisement and work out a modification. He says, look, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than to be a pig satisfied. I mean, that brings home to you that there's a qualitative difference between satisfactions. So that is, and the issue about the main problem about, one of the main problems about utilitarianism is, granted, given a situation where two actions come up by all your multifarious calculations with the same units of satisfaction, within the system there is no way to differentiate. One involves breaking a promise, and how do you decide which one you have to do? Utilitarianism cannot answer. You'll have to move outside the system to locate an answer. So in that respect, there are certain drawbacks. Okay, now we come to today's approach, which is deontological. Deon, we said, was an insistence on duty, okay, or a study of those approaches, an approach that would be duty-based. And the gentleman who is most classically and famously associated with this is Immanuel Kant, just as the person most associated with utilitarianism is John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham together. Kant develops his theory in a two-step process, and that is, first, he says, let's search around for something that is unconditionally good, something that can be good without qualification. What is it that can be good without qualification? He says, courage, intelligence, power, wealth, all these are goods. No, he's not denying that. But are they good without qualification? He says, no, and you can easily recognize that. I mean, courage in a terrorist is not particularly something that we would want, right? Intelligence in a thief is again something that is not very desirable. So, though these are virtues, these are goods, they are not unqualifiably good. I mean, even happiness, Kant goes to the extent of saying, even happiness is not unqualifiably good. Why? Because we find that those people who don't deserve happiness seem to get it, and those who deserve it don't seem to get it. And happiness also depends on a whole lot of, circumstances which are beyond your control. It depends upon luck, it depends upon where you are, in what family you have been born, etc., your temperament. Some people are pleased are happy with little. Some people require a lot to make them happy. This is all too many qualifications. And after his search around, he comes up with an offering. He says the only thing that is unqualifiably, unconditionally good, not in that if-then sense, okay, is a good will. I don't mean a will that you make at the end of your life or when you think your life is going to end, but act of will, a good will. Now you say, very profound, but what does this mean? What is Kant telling us by saying that a good will is the only unqualifiably good thing in the world? So we want to know, okay, we come up with lots of acts of willing. I mean, from the time we get up, we are involved in acts of willing. How do we know which acts of will are good, or what makes a will good? That is what Kant still has to tell us. Supposing we accept that a good will is the only good thing, unqualifiably so, we still need to know what makes a will good. And here Kant's answer is, a will is good when it wills from a sense of duty. That is, your act of willing is going to be good when you will from a sense or out of a sense of duty. This is critical in a sense to understand Kant, because this you can, if you want a punchline for utilitarianism, it is the greatest good of the greatest number, okay? If you want a punchline for Kant's theory, it is duty for duty's sake. It is not just duty. He's saying a will is good when it wills from a sense of duty, not just in accordance with duty. You might will in accordance with duty. For instance, you have all chosen to come here, right? You have come here, you are sitting right now before me, thankfully, okay? You could have been somewhere else. You could have, right or no. You could have chosen to go to your room and said, I'd rather sleep off this session. Who wants to know so much about philosophy? Enough. So why did you choose this? If you chose it, Kant's saying, even because you wanted to increase your knowledge, etc., that is not the best motive. The only motive that would make it moral, that would make your act moral, I mean, you can choose to increase your knowledge, but that is no moral merit that attaches to that decision. You should have willed to be here only because it is your duty to be here. That is it. If you want really to get moral value in that action of yours, that willing action, it must be from a sense of duty, not just in accordance with duty. Lots of things can be willed in accordance with duty, but it is for the sake of duty. This is where the stringency of Kant's approach comes in.
Satisfaction also be related to?
1 minute, very good question. In a sense, Kant is not concerned with satisfaction. That is why his theory is deontological. I should have mentioned this earlier. Thank you for bringing it up. Consequences of our action have no bearing at all on the morality of it. A teleologist would emphasize, would insist that the morality of an action can only be determined by its consequences. So increase your good, increase your satisfaction either for yourself or for others. Ethical egoism and utilitarianism are teleological because they emphasize that the morality of an act is to be determined by its consequences. Kant would flatly deny it. The morality of an action has nothing to do with its consequences, whether it brings me satisfaction or somebody else.
Say, if anyone does his duty, you mean that
he still has to tell us how to know what is our duty.
Right.
He hasn't told us how to know that. He has only brought us so far, at least I have brought you so far with respect to Kant, in saying, look, the only thing that is unqualifiably good is a good will. What makes a will good is willing out of a sense of duty. Now you still have to ask Kant, what is our duty? How do we know what is our duty? Kant has a very unique, really unique approach to telling us what our duty is. There's one more thing to emphasize here. Kant says, I mean, with respect to your question, and I'll read this out because it's just a short little thing. It says, even if it should happen that owing to a special disfavor of fortune, bad luck, okay, or to the niggardly provision of a stepmotherly nature, Kant is writing 18th century, yes? Don't expect him to use 20th century language. So, this will, supposing it happens out of bad luck or to some, niggardly provision of a stepmotherly nature, supposing you are handicapped in some way, challenged in some way, your act of will should wholly completely lack the power to accomplish its purpose, even supposing you could not accomplish that which you willed. You willed so strongly, hopefully, to come here at 11 o'clock, okay, to get another shot of philosophy. But because of some bad luck or because of something, you could not accomplish that. You could not accomplish what you willed. Despite that, Kant is saying, if with its greatest efforts, it should yet achieve nothing, okay, then like a jewel, it would still shine by its own light as a thing which has its whole value in itself. So you see what Kant is saying here? Consequences don't matter at all. It is what you have willed. And by will, he does mean good intentions, yes? We all know the cliche, hell is paved with good intentions. But he means by will, he means summoning everything that is in your power to bear on that particular action. That is what he means by the act of will. Not just, yes, I intend to go for the session, and that's enough. That will not make it your act of will. You have to bring everything to bear. If you are stuck in traffic, I don't know, you've got to do your damnedest to get out of it and be there at time. And despite all your efforts, if you fail to achieve your objective, you can't come. Kant says, no problem. Your act would still shine like a jewel. Now we'll come to the second step of his theory, where he's going to tell us how to recognize what our duty is. And there he says, look, this is an echo of what Pravesh has been talking to us in terms of logic, justifiability, inconsistency, and so on. Kant's criterion for how to recognize what your duty is. He's not going to give us a list of what our duties are. So it's not in that sense a code book of duties that he's going to offer us. He is offering us a criterion which is purely formal. And he says, try and, maxim in his use is rule, act on that rule which you can will to be a universal law of human conduct. So what is he telling us? He's saying, if you want to know what your duty is, try and will that everybody should do it. If you can do so consistently meaning without being involved in a contradiction. Now, why does he insist on this? Because for Kant, man, unlike other species, is a rational human being. And no matter how else we differ, as Pravesh said, the one thing we all share is our capacity for reason. So Kant is basing his ethics on that, let's say, foundation. And what is the central aspect of reason? That something which is contradictory is not acceptable. Something which says of the form like, today is a bright day and today is not a bright day can't be acceptable. Kant is really telling us that by his criterion, if you cannot, it is going to be contradictory to will an immoral act. Why? Because you cannot consistently universalize an immoral action. You cannot consistently universalize. An example will make this clear. One of his examples is promise keeping, correct? We all know that we should keep our promises. So Kant says, fine, very good. You want to break a promise, and you will say that that's an immoral act, right? So Kant says, fine. Now you see how my criterion operates. Try and will that everybody should break promises. Try and make that act, which we all recognize as immoral, try and universalize it. and you will see that it is logically impossible to universalize it. It would be contradictory to universalize it. Why? Because in one and the same action, in one and the same act of willing, so to speak, you are both willing that everybody should keep promises and everybody should break promises. That is contradictory, that you recognize as contradictory. How it is contradictory, I'll try and show you. When is a promise? When, let's put it in another way. Let's approach it from another example. Lying, for instance, is another example that Kant would be comfortable with. When is a lie told? Why do you tell lies? Why do we all tell? We've all told lies, yes? And I'm pretty sure we will continue to tell lies. Not big, big lies, small lies. So none of us are saints. Why do we tell a lie? I don't mean the motivation. I mean, what is the purpose? When I tell a lie, what do I expect it to be taken as? Exactly. If my lie is to be significant at all, then I must lie against the context of everybody telling the truth, no? Only then is my lie meaningful. Now, if I want to lie and take it to be my duty, Kant says you try and universalize it, what will happen? You are at the same time willing that people should lie and people should not lie. People should not lie because why? Otherwise your lie is meaningless. If everybody lies, would there be any point in lying? It would be irrational to lie. Your lie is meaningful only because everybody is expected. Everybody is expected to tell the truth. Only that is what makes your lie meaningful. You see? And at the same time, you want to will that everybody should not lie. So you're willing something that is inconsistent. That is the kernel, if you like, of Kant's doctrine. So it is a formal criterion that he's giving us, and it is just one principle. You use that principle, and you will come to know. There are a host of problems associated with Kant's theory. Not everybody can swallow it, not just because it is so Spartan. I mean, it's a pretty harsh approach to ethics, yes? It's not comfortable, do what increases satisfaction and so on and so forth. Duty for the sake of duty, and, duty is recognizable on the basis of the principle of non-contradiction. This seems to be all very, very far removed from our everyday decisions that we have to make. But it is really that is the contribution of Kant, if you really want to look at it that way, to the domain of ethical thinking, that he has insisted on the fact that Pravesh brought out before. If an ethical principle is to be accepted, it has to be universalizable. Otherwise, how do you accept it? There's no question of a private ethics. I mean, I do this and you do what you want. In saying that honesty is good, I am saying that everybody should be honest. In saying that it is right to be generous, I am saying that everybody should be generous. It's not just I should be generous and everybody else can do what they want. Okay, now one problem is what I will point out with respect to Kant. It's on parallel lines with the situation with utilitarianism. Supposing using this criterion of duty, in the sense of I am going to try and universalize. So granted, we cannot universalize lying, and for the same reason, we cannot universalize promise breaking, because if everybody makes promises, who will make them? Would it be rational to make a promise if everybody was breaking promises, if it was the norm to break promises? What would be the point of making a promise? Tell me, do you appreciate that fact? If the given condition, if it was the situation that promises are never going to be kept, would anybody make a promise? There would be no point in making a promise. Okay? So now supposing you have these two actions. You should not lie. You should not break promises. Agreed that they are moral by Kant's criterion. They are both moral. It's your duty, therefore. What happens when these two conflict? when, for instance, you have to lie in order to keep a promise. What then? No. How do you resolve this issue when two duties come up from the same principle that it is immoral to lie, it is immoral to break your promises, but how do you decide when you have to lie in order to keep a promise?
If everybody lies to keep a promise, universalizing everybody should lie to keep a promise, is it okay?
Then
That's
you
the
have moved
concept.
beyond that level of the maxim. You are moving into another level of the maxim. I don't know whether I'm getting that across. No. Okay. Pravesh, do you have an insight on this? That would be very straightforward to put across.
See, what happens is, how did you know that you should not lie? Because it has come from this category, this particular, criteria of universalizability. So that has become your duty, right? Not lying is your duty.
And it is,
Keep
yes,
your
one
promise.
more thing, Pravesh, just a minute. It is your categorical duty.
Yes.
Unconditional. That's why this principle is called a categorical imperative. It's not if you want to save lives, if you want the world to be a better place, then you do this. No, you do this. This is going to be your duty.
Right?
It's
And
not
then
conditional.
You have a second principle which tells you, keep your promises. Right? Now, both of these principles have come out from the same criteria of universalization. So, both are your duties. Now, if the same criteria gives you another principle which says it is okay to break promises or it is okay to lie, then there is a contradiction which arises from that very principle of universalizability. So, that cannot be a criteria.
Whatever one criteria we are forming, suppose we are forming the criteria that promises should be kept, suppose. So according to this concept that you are saying, we are not, like she said, can't we modify it or amend it and make a new criteria?
You can do whatever you want provided it is universalizable. Can you consistently, and by universalizable, oh yes, we can want to universalize everything. You be as selfish as you want. That's not what Kant is saying. But in willing it to be universal, are you involved in inconsistency or not? That is the issue for Kant. So if you're not involved in inconsistency, go ahead. He's given you a criterion of universalizability. That is all that I have for you before I hand over the podium to my colleague. He has a lot more to tell you, and we can continue. I mean, that I have put a stop to explaining Kant doesn't mean that we can push Kant away. You probably have a lot of issues with Kant still. In fact, if you don't, I'd be surprised. But he will take you forward into other areas. Thank you very much.